Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by one of the industry's greatest and most versatile cinematographers, Seamus McGarvey. Over the course of his career, this extraordinary artist has shot films such as High Fidelity, The Hours, Charlotte's Web, Along Came Polly, World Trade Center, Atonement, The Soloist, Anna Karenina, The Avengers, Godzilla, 50 Shades of Grey, Nocturnal Animals, The Greatest Showman, Bad Times at the El Royale, and many more. It is my pleasure to welcome Seamus McGarvey.
Thank you for the invitation, Michael. And listening to that long list, my hair was going grayer and grayer like Koyana Squatsy there, with all the memories of the films as I age myself.
I can imagine it's a stressful job at times, but you're still fairly young. I mean, you're 53 if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right. Yes. I still feel like I'm 21 in my head. It's the only way I kind of keep the kind of the chutzpah going. I don't acknowledge my age. I like to keep a sort of a curiosity uh, that keeps me going. I like that about the job.
Great, that's a great attitude. You first started out, if I'm not mistaken, as a still photographer. Then you worked on music videos, multiple ones, and then you had the transition to the film world. Could you please elaborate on your beginnings and the long road to the film world?
Yeah, well, it started with photography, not professionally, I should say. This was when I was firstly at school, and it was just as a way of, it was a great grounding towards cinematography because photography and cinematography are linked and analogous. But I lived in Northern Ireland, and it was at the time when there was a lot going on there, as historians can tell you, that we were in the middle of a war effectively, and my hometown was kind of Armagh in Northern Ireland was sort of the epicenter of that, and I found in photography a way of looking at my hometown that I was watching on the news every night, with soldiers running around and violence happening, bombs going off. It was reflected. The place where I lived was reflected in a way that I almost didn't recognize, psychologically at least. So the stills camera allowed me, as a relatively solitary person anyway, I've always enjoyed that, to pick up a camera and go off on long walks with my little dog, and just see the world through a lens. And it was really interesting because I was just sort of exploring at that point. I wasn't trying to make great photographs or good photographs. It was just as a way of looking at things through a lens. And when I ended up learning about processing those photographs and in my darkroom, I was really enjoying the transformative effect of the choices you make when you look at something in the real world and what happens in the camera, almost like an alchemical device that shifts things from the real towards the poetic. There's a distance from what was sitting in front of you because of the choices you make, either in terms of what's happening with light or the lens that you choose to shoot that particular scene with. And that was really the best education that I could have gotten, because not only did it teach me about the mechanics of photography and eventually the ability to forget about those mechanics and to work instinctively, um, but it also taught me about time and how important it is to take the time to look, particularly on a film set now. No matter, we all know film sets are quite chaotic places, and there's always a assistant director tapping their watch, going, "Come on, let's move on, move on, move on." And there's a kind of a haste which sometimes works against the creative spirit and your ability to distinguish between what's a good way of approaching a particular scene and a mediocre or a bad or a formulaic way. So time is very important, that I learnt from walking around my hometown and in the countryside surrounding it.
Great, thank you very much for elaborating on that. And I would like to briefly cover your music video experience. I mean, you have quite the resume here. I mean, we are talking about Coldplay, Paul McCartney, Dusty Springfield, the Rolling Stones, U2, and also Robbie Williams. And how do you approach music videos? Because essentially they are just a small film, basically.
Well, they're very different. I mean, they're similar in that, you know, you're using a camera, you're working at the time. All music videos I was shooting were shot on film. They were usually 16mm or Super 16. And I was operating. So because I was doing quite a few of them, you know, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, it was almost like gigging. You know, it was like being in a band and playing pubs every night. You kind of get quite good with your instrument, and it also taught me about this kind of how spectacular photography can be. And I mean that in a good and a bad way. Because with music videos, usually the impulse was to create the most kind of startling pictures, and to do stuff that was tricksy or unusual in some way. So I learned a huge amount about technique, about different stocks, about processing, different lenses. You know, every music video I would do usually had a different photographic approach. And that was just a way of creating this encyclopedia of approaches, which I was able to kind of create a kind of a little vault or a library of technique, again, which I could draw upon as required when appropriate. When you're reading a script and you go, oh gosh, do you remember that time I cross-processed some reversal film and the effects that had when I applied a red enhancer filter, or, you know, all these things that I then subsequently employed in the service of narrative, you know, when it was appropriate. Like I needed to do a flashback sequence, but we couldn't wait for the Super 8 film that was scripted to come back, and it was too risky to do that in any case. So we shot on 16mm cross processed, and it had that Super 8 vibe, and things like that I really learned about technique. And I'm a great music fan. So there I was in my 20s, working with all my heroes of music. Like, I'm a Beatles fan, Stones fan. I was working with them. I was touring with the Stones. You know, it was, all those things were just very, very exciting as well as educational.
Great. Do you have a favorite touring experience with any artist, or any favorite music video experience with an artist you really admire?
Oh God, Michael. I mean, I've got lots of them. You know, as I mentioned, touring with the Stones all over America and Canada was twice actually on 2 different tours, 4 years apart. Was really extraordinary, because you're in the inner sanctum effectively, and that was directed by my great friend Michael Apted, who just sadly passed away recently. And you know, that was just great fun, because we were shooting live videos as well as kind of ad hoc behind the scenes footage in quite intimate scenarios with the band. And we did some interviews which were really beautifully revealing. And in fact, they were so, because of the amount of time we spent with them over a period of months, they really opened up to us, particularly Keith and Charlie. And the stuff they said was so tender and sad, exhilarating, because it was framed against the live gigs that we were doing, but also quite sad because they were revealed themselves, and the life on the road, and the kind of divisive effect that can have on relationships and marriages and all that. And they were just very, very open. They're both incredibly articulate people. And in the end, that material didn't end up in the documentary, but it's there in an archive somewhere, I'm sure, because the Stones actually were funding this film. So it's there somewhere, and I hope it sees the light of day someday.
Great,
But
thank you.
the other one that I had a great experience on was Dusty Springfield, her very last video, only some months before she died. And I co-directed it with a man called Sean O'Hagan, who's an eminent writer about photography and the arts in the Observer in London. And I shot it, but we spent 3 days with Dusty in the west of Ireland in Galway for a song called Roll Away. And one of the highlights of my life, in fact, was at the end of the video, which was quite emotional because Dusty knew she was dying, but nobody else around in our crew did, except her manager, Vicky. And at the last day, Dusty, in this great hotel that we were staying in, it was actually a private home or a guest home, but it was a Craig Castle, and it had a huge oak panelled great room, and there's a roaring fire and an Irish wolfhound sitting there. And Dusty, I'll never forget it as long as I live. She got up on a kind of a coffee table, and like a miniature stage, and sang at the top of her voice beautifully, "Son of a Preacher Man," and it was unforgettable because it filled the room, and we were all in tears because it sounded like the vocal mic single track from the recording. It was right there, and she just stepped down from that stage, and I can still remember the image of her standing silhouetted against a roaring fire, with her head down, just looking at the little dog after singing the song, with us all absolutely aghast at what we'd just been privileged to witness.
Great. Thank you very much, Seamus, for sharing this story with me and our audience. Thank you very much. And as I mentioned in my introduction, you've worked on so many films, and the list is most impressive, actually. How would you describe the process of, let's say, adding worth and personality and character to a film when you work with a director? Is there a certain technique you are most fond of yourself?
It's a very interesting question, that, Michael, because the adding verve or personality to a project, I think, should come naturally, and it should come through collaboration. I love the collaborative effect, the social aspect of making a film, because you just don't land in a film and project your cinematography onto it. It comes through discussions that are osmotic and to and fro between you and the director, primarily the production designer, the everybody, costume, all those wonderful democracy of ideas, round table discussions feed into like a common view of the film, a communal view of the film that actually embellishes it beyond what I could contribute. The people often mistake great photography or good photography, maybe on a film that I've worked on, for instance, like Atonement or Anna Karenina. They say, "Oh, the photography," but actually, what they're talking about is design. The design was extraordinary. The choice of colors, the kind of the movement of the color through the film. It's kind of the thought that goes into that is often done collaboratively, is what makes the photography good. And that's what I become, a different cinematographer, actually, with every film I do, with each director I work with. And I like that about it, because it shows that I'm not relying on formula, I hope, and I don't want to have an identifiable style that I can repeat and kind of pull out of a backpack and just stick on a film, because that would be, well, lazy for a start. And it also means that you're not finding the sort of photographic heart of the script, which exists in every film. There's something peculiar and specific cinematographically that's sort of inside every film. And it's up to we as cinematographers to kind of find that, build upon it, and obviously bring it our own creative personalities to it, hopefully in a gentle way, and no less kind of evocative, but certainly something that isn't going screaming me, but more we.
That's very interesting too, because the you mentioned the art and of course the set design and the filmmaking process. Of course, merges different art forms, if you will. You know, we are talking about the storytelling process, the screenwriting process, the scoring process, then of course the cinematography, and of course technology changes and evolves constantly. And if I'm not mistaken, you use analog equipment primarily, right?
I love shooting on film. I really do, but I'm an avid user of it, and I try to use film when I can. There are times when digital is more appropriate, and actually with every month even that passes, the digital medium is getting better and better. And I wasn't a fan of it 3 or 4 years ago, but I'm resolutely a fan of digital now. I've been just finished a film recently um, called Cyrano. I've always been a great fan of shooting on film. It's how I started, and it's how I like to work. I love the I love the discipline of shooting on film. The kind of that feeling that the material itself is precious, and you just can't let it roll, as often happens with a lot of digital productions. The camera's just rolling. There's no cut. There's no sense of the inner sanctum, that sacred moment when everything's silent and the clapperboard goes on and you can hear the gentle whirring of a camera. And there's something in that. It's like it becomes a sort of a divining rod, and actors feel it, the crew feels it. There's a respect to the moment, and I found that diminishing a lot. I mean, it's something that I like to with directors have a almost like a manifesto before we start, like a big talk with everybody saying this is special moments. Silence is absolutely a prerequisite. Turn off your cell phones. Don't talk during a take. Don't whisper. Don't even look at the actors. Turn your heads away. An actor doesn't want a load of dimly lit, glowing faces all staring at them like cat's eyes in a forest while they're doing a take. So all those things are sort of intrinsic to the film way of working. Now I'm hoping that we're pulling that back again, but technically speaking, I mean, most of my films have been on celluloid, but the last few I've done have been on digital, and that's because that medium, it's quite different, but it is so good in certain ways, like working at low light levels, working with available light in the back of shots at night. All those things are quite interesting. Or, contradicting myself here, the use of long takes for particularly very emotional scenes where you do need to create that silence and let an actor get up to speed, if you like, or get into that zone that they need to get into, which sometimes can take longer than a film magazine would have allowed for. So I think there are benefits to both, and I must say that I love digital now, and I own 2 cameras, but I will shoot whatever's appropriate to the film.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Seamus. And I think this day and age, people I think, tend to worry about technology too much. We have to use 2K cameras or 4K. And I think Netflix and Amazon, for instance, they also put it in their contracts that you need to shoot using a 4K digital camera because of the Dolby Vision and the UHD format and so on. But I think at times it could be stifling, to worry about technology too much.
I think what's important is the why, not the how of cinema. And, why do you shoot in a particular way? And at that point, I mean, I think Ari's Alexa camera, which was beautiful, those sensors they had at the time was 2.8K. So people were gravitating towards red, which is a look that I'm not particularly fond of. I mean, it's very different, and I don't want to get libelous here, but it just has a different feel to it that's sort of stuck in my craw somehow. Again, they're getting a lot better too, but I think it's recently the digital films that I've shot have been on large format, using the Alexa LF and using Leica lenses. Which I've been really, really happy with, because there's something in the large format that with those beautiful lenses that reminds me of my stills photography days. That it has a certain, it feels like working with a medium format, like a
Yes.
Hasselblad or a Rolly. And that's why it becomes its own thing. It's totally different to shooting on spherical and on film with Super 35 or 35. It has its own look, and it's been the first time that I've gone, wow, now digital has its own sort of photographic feel signature. And that's something that that is specific to the medium, that can imbue a particular project with a photographic feel. So, I think it's just a case of knowing what the tools are, knowing what you have in front of you, the sort of paradigm of possibilities that exist, and choosing what's right for the film, and being able to express to a director what those photographic attributes of each choice may be, and involving everyone in the choice. So that's the thing. It's film making is like a centipede on overtime. It's a grouping of lots of people who all individually make decisions towards a collective goal, and obviously that those kind of notions and ideas all filter through the director, who must say, I like that, or I'll deflect that idea. But so ultimately it has this kind of distillation process that ends up giving it the authorial voice of a film, of a film with a through line. But it's very interesting to see how myriad and kaleidoscopic
Yes.
those influences are.
Seamus, if a filmmaker came to you and said, I would really like to hire you for my new project, but show me some footage first in order to be considered for the job, which film or which scene would you pick as it really showcases your specific talent? Any film, any scene in order to get the gig?
Well, I would send them a 15-second clip of a documentary that I worked on with my friend Sophie Huber. It was a documentary about the great actor Harry Dean Stanton. And in it, which we shot on a Canon 5D, very lovely little stills camera, but with the video capability. And we made it over 5 years. But one day that we were shooting this, it was made for no money, but it's available now. It's called Partly Fiction, but it's not in the film, but in between takes. And I have it as a little clip I could send you for a laugh. Harry says, eat after I'd made them both a cup of coffee, which David Lynch said was a great cup of coffee, which was another great moment in my life. But Harry said to David, you know, Seamus is quite good. David Lynch goes, this is what I hear. And when people ask for footage or show me what you can do, I just send them that 15-second clip. And I've never missed out on a job because of that. Because for that very reason I was describing, every film has a different, distinct photographic center. And it sends people down the wrong trail if you send them a 5-minute Steadicam shot from Atonement, or other moments that I've sort of worked on that are kind of triumphant in terms of that they've got a feeling, because every film is so different. And when I worked on Nocturnal Animals with Tom Ford, I went for the meeting for the interview. And at the end of the interview, he said, I really want you to do this film. And I'm so impressed that you walked in here without a bag full of books and references and photographs that other people have just come in and sort of put down on the table. And he said, I like the fact that we've sat here for half an hour just talking into the film, talking about the film. And he said, that's how I'd like to progress if you want to do this job while we prep the film. So for the first 2 weeks of our preparations for the film, with the designer, production designer, Shane Valentino, and Ariane Phillips, the costume designer, we just sat around in Tom's house talking into the film, talking about the thematics, talking about the philosophy of the characters, talking about, because Tom's belief was that images, and he's one of the great image makers of our time, as well as being the greatest designer, but he's a brilliant photographer. And he said, images are so totemic and overwhelming when you just sort of paste them around the place. And he was absolutely right. So in those discussions that were amongst 4 reasonably articulate people, words are much more fluid. They're much more elastic in terms of how you describe the images, because people cling on to pictures. That's just our nature. Whereas with words, the imagination kind of concertinas, expands and contracts and allows things in and allows for connections with the other people. So after 2 weeks of those discussions, we realized that we had actually refined the view of the film down to certain constituents, ingredients that, like any good cook will tell you, that simplicity is the essence. And then, only then, did we bring out pictures and put them on the table, pictures that were sort of destined to be in our movie. So that was really great. And there could have been pages ripped from a magazine with the color of a dress, or it was about color mostly initially, and then it became about landscape, and then it became about portraiture. But we all knew exactly what we were going towards collectively, and that was really exciting. And I think that the film shows that sort of cogitation, those discussions that distilled the picture cinematographically and holistically.
Nocturnal Animals is actually a very good example. Tom Ford directed it. I think it was his second feature film, if I'm not mistaken. And it has a very impressive look, actually. So the visual cohesiveness and the visual storytelling is very important. And I unfortunately didn't have the time to rewatch all the movies you worked on, so I would have liked to have rewatched Nocturnal Animals, but I vividly remember the cinematography and also the shot at the end with Amy Adams in the restaurant. I thought that was a great way of closing the film.
Yes, Tom has got a wonderful poetic spirit. And because he is so, I suppose, such a genius, he is, I mean, as a designer, but as an image maker too, he knows the power of simplicity. I mean, what a great reference for us when we did end up talking about images was Carl Dreyer and the Passion of Joan of Arc, and just the absolute power of the close up in cinema, and just letting an actor act in a not spectacular fancy shot, simply a close up of them looking into the distance or looking into their drink. And that is the power of that scene, which we shot in a restaurant in LA, Japanese restaurant. It's a privilege to work also with an actor like Amy Adams. I mean, with Amy Adams, you just don't have to do anything really. You just have to make sure your exposure is right and that your lighting has a sense of some drama, and you create a quiet space for them to delve into whatever they're delving into. I don't know, it's a mystery to me what actors do, but I've been very privileged to be the witness, photographically speaking, to capture some great moments that actors do. And I love how, with that respect for what an actor does, you know, because they're reflecting the human condition. That's why we feel something when we look at a film, because you're identifying, we're like little monkeys, we're looking at the changes in their iris, their eyes, that we're looking at the way tiny muscles in their face kind of move. We look into that. So cinema doesn't need exaggeration.
Yes.
To make an audience feel something or identify and feel something and see themselves in an audience, in an actor's face.
Yes.
That's the essence of cinema for me.
Yes, very well put. Thank you, Seamus. And that's a good point, actually, because you have worked on intimate and also character-driven films, you know, such as The Hours, for instance. You know, it's a very good movie. It stars, you know, Julianne Moore, there is Meryl Streep, John C. Reilly, and also Ed Harris. And you use different styles for each location. The film takes place in, let's say, I think one section in the 50s or the 60s, and then, of course, the present time. And I think these films offer you a chance, at least that's what I believe, to really explore a character, an actor, the facial expressions and the mannerisms.
Yes. Well, that was, you know, again, discussions with Stephen Daldry, the director, who was wonderful. There are those three eras: Virginia Woolf in the 20s, there was the 1950s, LA, which we actually shot in Miami, and the present day New York, which was shot in New York, and in the studio in London with Meryl Streep, Alison Janney. It was really exciting to work on a film like that, and with the ability to really define the eras of each location, and yet, because there was a superimposition, obviously these stories were sort of parallel action, and that was played with throughout, because it's about the storytelling, and there's lots of mirroring and intertwining. There's a dance between the eras. So we had great fun devising camera movement that was reflected in each one, but at the same time differentiating each section, but not wanting to make it so strident in its difference that it would pull an audience out of it. So again, it was shooting on film, but I had great fun with different photographic techniques and photochemical techniques in the laboratory. You know, pulling the film. That means processing it, like underexposing it, or overexposing and pull developing to create lower contrast. the use of filtration of various types, a very special print process at the end called SEE, which is kind of like a gentle bleach bypass, which leaves more silver in the print image, all give it this this particular hue, I suppose, and feeling. So that was great fun testing with that. And the producer, actually, Scott Rudin, who's like an eminent producer from New York, he was very, very involved in all those decisions and came along with me to the laboratory at every instance to kind of to see what I was getting up to and cooking in my little chemistry lab. So I really enjoyed that part of it. It was great, and we had a great shoot. In fact, at the end of it, when we did Nicole Kidman's section as Virginia Woolf, she had this prosthetic nose, and it was great because we were at one point shooting where she lived with her husband Leonard Woolf in this area of Luton outside London, and she would just leave the prosthetic nose on at the end of a day's shoot, and we'd go to the pub. And I remember going into the pub with her and some of my camera crew, and there was a karaoke night going on. And I remember her getting up and singing Suspicious Minds in a packed pub with nobody knowing. I mean, she was married to Tom Cruise at the time, in fact, just about to get divorced, and very, very famous in every tabloid, and nobody had a clue that it was Nicole Kidman on stage singing Suspicious Minds. But yeah, there are funny things that happen and that are almost stranger than fact.
As I mentioned before, I rewatched several of your movies. High Fidelity, which is one of my favorite comedies, stars John Cusack, Jack Black, among others. A very good comedy. And my favorite scene in there is actually, believe it or not, when Tim Robbins walks into the record store, and he starts giving his speech, please stop bothering us, and then he says, shall we leave it at that? And then one of the guys rips out the phone and smashes it into his face, and you can see the teeth fly out. That's my favorite moment of High Fidelity.
We had great fun on that. I mean, looking at that now, I wish that I could re-photograph it, because I honestly didn't know what end of a camera to look through. I certainly was not very good at the lighting is atrocious. But it has a certain innocence and kind of, a curious eye at times. I got the job. An interesting story was I was showing a film that I'd worked on, The War Zone, that Tim Roth directed, at the Edinburgh Film Festival, and I walked into the bar, which was packed, and there was one seat available by a little table with another person, a man sitting there, and I sat down and started talking to this man. I said, "Oh, how are you doing?" And I said, "Are you here to see some films?" He said, "I'm coming to see a film, Warzone." I said, "Oh, I'm actually the cinematographer of that." He said, "Really? Oh, that's interesting. What's your name?" And I told him my name, and he said, "I've been looking for you. This is Stephen Frears, the director." I didn't know it at the time. And then he introduced himself, and I went, "Oh my God, I love your films." And he said, "Well, how would you like to come to Chicago and shoot a film? My cinematographer has just abandoned me." And I think that might have been Oliver Stapleton. And I said, "Wow, yes." And 2 weeks later, I was in Chicago prepping High Fidelity. It was just one of those gift moments in life that was just serendipity. It was the best pint of lager I ever bought in my life. The kind of absolute serendipity of it. And I never looked back after that. That was my first studio film for Disney. And, I've done a few since that for them. And for Working Title, I've just done another one. So it was a kind of turning point in my career, that pint.
And if anybody out there who's listening will be listening when the interview's online. If you're looking for a great comedy of the early 2000s, which deals with great characters and relationships and love, High Fidelity is definitely a film to explore. So that's really, really good and great achievement.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Michael.
You're welcome. And I think you shot it in 178 or 185 to 1, and I would like to talk about aspect ratios because, for instance, Bad Times at El Royale or also Godzilla, these were also shot using anamorphic lenses, 239 to 1 or 235 to 1 if I'm not mistaken. Could you elaborate on the decision making process as to which aspect ratio is the one to go for depending on the film?
Well, there's aspect ratio and there's choice of lenses. So for instance, Bad Times at El Royale was on film using anamorphic C-series lenses. That lensing gives a particular feel as well as the aspect ratio. Whereas films that I've shot by the same aspect ratio, I've elected to use spherical lenses for whatever reason. Like for instance, Life, which use spherical lenses because you can focus much closer. You can work to lower light levels because the lenses are faster, i.e. they open up wider and let more light in. Anamorphic lenses tend to you disintegrate a little bit at the edges. But anamorphic lensing have peculiarities to them. They've got funny little bits of personality, and deficiencies that actually I really love. Sometimes you want to put that into the image. Like for instance, on We Need to Talk About Kevin, that Lynn Ramsey directed, we used again the C-series lenses on film, but the bend of those, the horizontal bend of the wider lenses in particular, and the fall off of focus at the top and bottom and edges was something that she wanted to play with. Aspect ratio is very important because it's a subtle way of positioning in frame, and it guides the way that you choreograph the actors and design a shot, because it's like a particular frame. It's effectively your frame on the picture. So I love that choice, and I take it very seriously before a film. I got some criticism on Atonement, for instance, for choosing the 185, the slightly higher squarer format, as opposed to the classic CinemaScope widescreen format of 235. And people said it's such an epic scenes. Why did you choose that? And it was towards the portraiture of the film, particularly in the early part, that I wanted to shoot on that, and Joe wanted to shoot that way. The same actually with the Avengers, which the fanboys went crazy about, because it was again 1:185, and I was really able to. I chose that because of the disparate heights of the various characters. The Hulk was so tall, and Black Widow and the others were, and it was shot in the city. New York had this towering perspectives that I felt needed the higher frame. So it's interesting how it changes. I mean, personally, I always think of films as being in the 235 realm, because it that space, that the wide space, allows you to play with movement within the frame. The way an actor moves, you can play with a close-up, but also show it in context around. And there's something really intriguing about that, because it's a format, it's an aspect ratio that really doesn't exist so much in either painting. it seems to be peculiar to cinema. So it's something that I like. It's like here we are in a film, is
Yes,
what it immediately suggests.
yes,
But at the same time, I love films that recently, films I've greatly admired. Pavel Klosky's Cold War, for instance, and Ida were shot in almost like a 1:33 or a 4:3 format, which I thought worked so beautifully, especially when he used these very oblique compositions and people in the bottom right or left of frame and with huge amount of headroom. And I don't see it as diminishing the the kind of scope of a picture, because now that everything's digital, you can, particularly digital projection, you can play with formats even within the same film. I just did an interview with Spike Lee, where he was talking about the Five Bloods, which and Tom Siegel, his cinematographer, elected to shoot in various aspect ratios, and you see it actually shifting as you watch the movie,
yes.
and it's really really inventive and beautiful to witness.
It is
So
the Vietnam flashback scenes had a different aspect ratio than the scenes
yeah.
in present day.
Well, there were three different aspect ratios in that film. There was the
Yes,
16:9 for the when they first arrive in Ho Chi Minh City, and the then the jungle was 2:35, and then they shot on reversal film with all that beautiful grain of on 16 mil for all those sequences in war and flashback, which they said was terrifying because it was with Chadwick Boseman, it was with all that stuff, it was the most expensive part of the movie, and they had to shoot on all the available Ektachrome in the world and used up the entire stock of it that Kodak could produce, and they didn't know that it was good until they'd left the jungle and had come back. It took so long to process, like 2 weeks, that they basically didn't know they had it. It was like a huge gamble, but really brave and looked fantastic. I loved that sort of bravery. The fact that now it's very difficult to do those things because people know about, well, we need that set uh, struck, we need it cleared off. So we know we've got it on digital, but with film, you just don't for a few days usually. So it was fantastically brave, but I love those acts of faith that happen when you've got a true filmmaker like Spike Lee,
yes, yes,
who
absolutely.
has the authority also to make those decisions to say, yeah, we're doing it this way because it's going to look fantastic.
Yes, and it's a very good film. I enjoyed it a lot, and yes, you're right. The let's say decision making process as to, let's say, which ratio to use can be very crucial. And when I watched the Avengers for the very first time, I actually thought it was going to be 235 or 239, but and I was a little bit surprised that it was actually 185, but it didn't bother me one bit, and I don't know why certain people may have a problem with that or not. So that's their decision, but it's a big spectacle, and I mean, I can only imagine that you received even more job offers, because of films, like the Avengers and also Godzilla or The Greatest Showman or 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, I mean, we shot that. I think it's the Avengers is the only Marvel film that's been shot that way, 1:185, and I love those films at scale, of scale, because it's exercising different photographic muscles. On the question of aspect ratio, I think it's interesting. I mean, the Avengers was 185, which I got a little bit of criticism for, but I think ultimately it was the right decision, and Joss Whedon and I sort of embraced that the height, but it ended up being the only Marvel film I think that's been shot in that ratio. Um, but that film for me was very important because it did lead to the opportunity to shoot other films that were on quite a scale. And I really enjoy doing that. I mean, my preference is towards sort of smaller scale films that are, as you say, character driven. But it's really exciting going on a set. And I used to like drive when we shot the Avengers in Albuquerque in New Mexico. And it's quite terrifying, really, driving over the hill towards the studios there and seeing the sea of juggernauts and the activity and the scale of a production like that. Um, it's quite overwhelming and terrifying, in fact. But I love it because you're exercising different photographic muscles. It's like photographic Pilates, I call it.
Yeah.
But the lovely thing is that once you're on the set, it's the same as the Avengers or Godzilla or The Greatest Showman is exactly the same as We Need to Talk About Kevin or The
Yes.
War Zone or Butterfly Kiss, all those no budget, low budget films that it's basically that contract between you and the actors and their performance and that kind of cinematic sort of lightning in a bottle that you're trying to capture with your camera.
And I must say, I'm actually very fond of your style, and I also love your tracking shots and how you move the camera. I mean, you mentioned Atonement, the Dunkirk Steadicam shot, which went on, I think, for 5 minutes, a solid 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Which was really, really, really great. Or Anna Karenina. It's a prime example of good cinematography in my book. Or the Greatest Showman. I just rewatched that yesterday. It's a very well shot movie, and the way you use the camera to follow the actors when they're doing the dance routine and the vocal performances. So that's really, really, really good, and I really like the Greatest Showman. I think it's a very inspiring and sweet movie, and I think it shows your skill and versatility as a cinematographer, as one of the leading cinematographers, if I may add.
Again, it's a very different style and a very different requirement. The cinematography on a film like The Greatest Showman, where I drew upon my uh, music video days. We worked very closely with the choreographers, Ashley Wallen, and there is a production where spectacle and bombast is actually a prerequisite of the photographic style. And I kind of found a certain relief in that I didn't have to think as hard about character in those moments. That there had to be an unabashedly sort of exhilarating style to some of those dance numbers, and that was actually, it was fantastic to do, because I think that film, when it came out, got so slighted by the critics, who were very snooty about it and said that it was silly. But luckily, and I'm so proud of the fact that audiences proved the critics wrong and went in droves. In fact, it was still, until the pandemic hit, it was still showing in cinemas in London, in the Prince Charles. It was there like 2 years after its release. So that it's really lovely that cinema is a broad enough art form that you can do the weighty psychological dramas
Yeah.
and make something as enjoyable, simply enjoyable, as The Greatest Showman. And I think that that's as valid a part of cinema
Yes.
as the big weighty stuff.
Let's say the statements certain critics make. Well, I better not comment on this because some people. First of all, it's a state of preference, and second of all, I think some people just pan something for the sake of just doing it. They think they are the number one authority on certain things. So, 50 Shades of Grey also received a fair amount of criticism, which also has a very good photography. And did you and director Sam Taylor Johnson oftentimes worry about as to which scenes would actually work, and as to how far you could actually go with the relationship between those two parties and the bondage scenes?
Yes, you know, Sam and I have been friends for years. In fact, it's probably one of my most enduring friendships and collaborations because I've been working with Sam on her photographs and films when she was a fine artist working in London. So it almost goes back 30 years. So when she asked me, we'd done a short film together and also a feature film about John Lennon called Nowhere Boy before she got offered this big studio film. And I was like, Sam, don't do this. And she said, no, no, we're gonna push the boat out on this. It's gonna be fantastic. And she described certain things that she was planning and doing. And I felt that the book, and Erica, the writer, is a friend of mine. So the book has its audience. And the book doesn't need to go into sort of elaborate scenography in order to describe it, because a book exists in an audience's, in a reader's mind as much as in the writer's. So Erica, the writer, was being very faithful to her fan base and wanted a very sort of direct, sort of photographic replication of it. But obviously, the two mediums are different. And Sam was trying to bring something possibly a little bit more experimental and certainly a bit more graphic, which I think the studio were up for, but Erica was not. Erica was wanted to be very faithful to her fan base, who wanted every line and every moment replicated exactly as it was inscribed in the book. And that led to a little bit of friction between Sam and Erica on not on set. I mean, they were very kind of diplomatic about it, but there were tensions there. And I think, cinematographically speaking, it was a missed opportunity from what we were intending to do together. And that's no fault of anybody's. But, when it came around to doing other films of the same series, we were not involved.
Yes.
And yeah, it was a shame. I think it could have been our version, 50 Shades of Grey, could have been sexier. It could have been fleshier.
Yes.
It could have been more dangerous in parts. Books can be quite difficult to portray, because especially hugely successful books,
Yes.
like 50 Shades of Grey, because of the fans' expectations.
I read one review a couple of weeks ago, and the person or the critic said, "This is a prime example of a film surpassing its book." He wasn't too flattering. He even, I mean, it's not my words, it's his. He called it a piece of garbage, and he said the film's way better than this crappy piece of literature. That's how he put it.
Yes. Oh God. Well, yeah. I wouldn't like to second that, obviously, because Erica is my friend. But
Yes, sure.
yeah, it's not my. I prefer different writing.
Seamus, if we still have a couple of minutes left,
Yeah.
I would like to ask you about working with Oliver Stone on World Trade Center, if you can comment on that. Oliver Stone has been described by some people as a method director who actually runs a pretty tight ship, and it can be a very, let's say, different experience than working with other directors. What was your experience like working on or shooting World Trade Center, if I may ask?
Oh, I loved working with Oliver, and he can be a bear of a man, uh, in a good way. He comes across to some people as having a kind of a bullish, kind of testosteronic kind of vibe about him, but actually he's incredibly wonderful, feminine sensibility about him for somebody who's so kind of hard boiled in many respects. He's one of the most intellectual directors I've ever worked with, and philosophical
Yes,
people.
I bet he is. Yeah.
And he's, as my late mother would say, there's more in his head than a comb would take out. So there's so much going on there that it's like being in a hurricane. Uh, Working with him, I never forget my first meeting with Oliver. I'd been invited to come to New York from, I was living in Edinburgh at the time, to come for an interview with him. Uh, and this was maybe 5 or 6 years after 9/11. Uh, and I remember arriving at a hotel downtown, just literally stepping off the plane at JFK, went in. I wasn't supposed to meet Oliver until the next morning. Uh, but as I walked in with my suitcase into the foyer of the hotel, there was Oliver Stone walking out with a few people en route to a recce, a scout looking for location at Ground Zero. And I thought, God, I've got to just go up and introduce myself. And I was wearing this sort of Western style shirt with sort of popper buttons on it, the classic Western style shirt. Anyway, I walked up to him and I said, Mr. Stone, I'm Seamus. I'm meeting you tomorrow with about the cinematography role. And he went, "What? You're Irish?" I said, "Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm Irish." He said, "Real Irish?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "How the fuck am I going to understand you?" He said, and he took my shirt at the lapels and popped it open, pop, 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 right down to my navel, and said, "Where are your fucking subtitles?" And that was that. And then he just gave me a big hug, and he said, "Get the concierge to send your case up to your room. We're going down to Ground Zero." And he put his arm around me, and he said, "Okay, you're doing this movie. I like you, son." And it was like, the next thing I was in a van. I'd literally arrived 5 minutes before. I was in a scouting van going downtown, and I spent the next few hours literally on the cleared site of 9/11. That was like nobody could go anywhere near that. It was like a grave site, and it was such a privilege. And the film itself was quite a ride, I've got to say. With lots of different like incidents that would I could almost write a book about it. But it was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had on a film. And
Right.
Oliver is such an extraordinary man, and I mean, before I worked with him, was one of my favorite film directors of all time, and
Yeah.
and and here I was actually making a film with him, and he's asked me back a few times on films that haven't happened, and also documentaries that I haven't been available for, but I'd love to work with him again.
He's one of my favorite directors too, and very, very good filmmaker. And thank you for sharing this story. That was quite amusing. That was really good. I mean, oh my goodness.
Sorry for the expletives, but
No, that's fine. That's fine. No worries.
I thought I'd tell it verbatim for the full effect.
Seamus, is there anything else you would like to add about your career up to this point? Anything else about your movies you're currently working on, or about Bad Times at the El Royale? Anything else that comes to mind to wrap up our great conversation?
Well, the only thing I would say is I didn't think that I'd be making a film during this pandemic, but I recently completed Cyrano, which Joe Wright, my old friend Joe Wright, asked me back after a number of films that he's been working with Bruno Delbonnel, and asked me back for this one. And it was really an extraordinary thing to try to make a movie during an pandemic. We were shooting in Sicily, and it was quite tough. I can't tell a lie. We were getting tested every 2 days, sometimes every day when we had lots of extras around. Um, and trying to make a movie with those restrictions and wearing masks and social distancing and all the things that it makes you do and what you can and can't do, and the time it takes and the lugubrious nature of trying to make a film in these times. But nevertheless, we got through it, and we got through it and finished on time and did that. But some of our last shooting took place on Mount Etna. And after the crazy year that we've all been through collectively, we were sitting there on Mount Etna, and suddenly there was rumblings, and we went, and then a huge plume of ash, and then lava going up in the air. And the crazy thing was, nobody batted an eyelid, because after the year that we've all been through,
Yes.
shooting on a volcano that was currently erupting was just like, okay, next. Sometimes people ask me, what advice would you give aspiring filmmakers or students? And all I would say is, look at the world around you for inspiration. You can look at movies, you can look at paintings, you can look at all these things that are tangible and are connected to cinema. But actually, the greatest inspiration I find is when I go for a walk, or if I'm looking out the window, as I am now, at a wall with winter sun projected through trees, and looking at the dance of shadows and the warm highlights and the lilac shadows. That to me is just a moment that fills me full of artistic spirit. And those are the things filmmakers can draw upon. It's like food. It's like food for filmmakers, is about the ability to look with an artist's eye. And if you can feed your artist's eye and look at the incidental and the epic in the everyday, then you'll be a good filmmaker, and you'll never be hungry for looking.
Thank you very much for those inspiring words. And Seamus, it was such a pleasure talking to you. I had a great time, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation too.
I did indeed, Michael. Thank you so much for the invitation.